I did find the quote.
Okay.
My note to myself just said, swayed by titties. So...
Yeah, hey, how are you?
Hello, welcome. Welcome to Left Unread.
I'm Will.
My name is Aaron. We are two dudes engaged in a radical self-education.
That's right, we're simply two of Stalin's strongest soldiers, heavy asterisk.
This episode, we are reading Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici.
Yeah.
I have an introduction. We oftentimes struggle with if we should or how to introduce modern writers and modern texts, and so oftentimes we just forego an introduction completely, but that felt wrong. In this case, we're trying to remedy that, so I wrote a little introduction here. Silvia Federici is perhaps the preeminent Marxist feminist of the modern era. Born in Parma, Italy in 1942, perhaps a notable time for a communist, Federici has a storied history of radical writing and militant activism, including co-founding in 1972 the International Feminist Collective that launched the Wages for Housework movement, which, if you don't know, demanded pay for domestic labor, often depended upon and taken for granted to be completed by women. And working through the 80s and beyond with the collaboration and founding of many organizations fighting for the liberation of women in Africa. Probably her most famous work, and the subject of today's episode, Caliban and the Witch, has made waves since its publication in 2004 for its reevaluation of Marx's take on primitive accumulation, instead centering the expropriation of women's labor as a precursor for colonization and capitalist expansion, which leads us to today's episode.
Yeah.
So I found this book fascinating. And, full disclosure, I'd read probably the first 2/3 of it 6 weeks ago before we took our break and then finished it up. So even coming back to the last 2 chapters in the last 2 weeks, it's felt kind of fresh all over again. And then reviewing everything for my notes was a lot of fun. So I don't know, this book was really fascinating to me. And I felt like was flipping switches that I didn't know were even there yet in my mind and my thinking.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed reading this, and it's for a bunch of reasons. Mainly, there's still such a blind spot in my mind in the transition, in the transition into capitalism. And I think that this really did a lot of work to fill in those gaps for me. That is what I appreciated probably the most about it. And it reframes that transition in a way that I think is really important for us to understand because, transition in itself is a loaded word. In the book, she says that it implies a gradual change, something that happens not all at once. And in reality, those eras of feudal reaction, as she says, were some of the most bloody eras of our history. The development of capitalism was certainly not something that happened naturally or something that happened evolutionarily. It was something that was forced upon us. It was a reaction. And I think that was really fantastic. On top of that, it's no surprise, I should say, that this book is taught in colleges. You know what I mean? Like, I think that it's clearly incredibly well researched.
Side note, the back matter for every chapter, there are 10 pages of footnotes for every chapter.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Not to mention all of the inline citations as well.
Yep.
This book is an academic piece for sure. And I think that part of the reason that it's so well received in academia is because it's quite critical of people like Marx and also of Foucault in a way that I think it's not meant to take those people down, but rather to expand on their theory. Maybe not so much on Foucault, more so on Marx. And I think that it really adds a lot to the conversation, not in a way that negates any of Marx's work, but simply expands it. And there is evident critique of Marx in here, but I think it's done in a way that is, it just shows a blind spot of Marx that is maybe of the era,
Yeah, for sure. I think I don't think it's critical of Marx in the sense of trying to denigrate the theory, but to expand the theory to identify that very evident blind spot.
Yeah.
And the thing that really spoke to me the most that she mentions late in the book, she ends up calling it the one single logic, I think. That's the part that really struck me is because this question of primitive accumulation and Marx just being like, there's accumulation and then capitalism is born. She's saying like, where does that come from? she's asking that question, and she's talking about, well, obviously the witch trials, but also talking about colonial expansion and slavery and the transformation of the social relation of domestic labor, all as being responses to this same stimulus, this same single logic that was imposed upon the proletariat that manifested in these forms of colonial expansion, of the persecution of women in the European witch trials, and obviously the use of things like slavery and slave labor, all being the manifestation of the same singular logic that bred capitalism, not that it came from capitalism.
Right. I love that, because that's how I've expressed my feelings about wanting to read this book in the past, is that racism and sexism are pillars that are hard for me to say stem from capitalism. I don't agree with that argument because they're just so ever present, and to really take a step back into history and to look at where capitalism came from, you can see that, exactly as you said, those things of sexism and racism, those pillars, were founded in the same eras of the same ideals, and for the same reasons, largely. I mean, that's like the main thing about this book. It's a feminist book, and that's the point, right? Marx is happy to talk about colonization. Marx is happy to talk about enclosure, but he's missing something that is just as critical. That's Silvia Federici's argument, is that the exploitation, the social hierarchy creation around women and their sexuality, the division of the working class into not just race, but also gender, is just as important in the foundation and the transition, quote unquote, into capitalism. And I think that that is just a blind spot that a lot of people have. Because, I mean, we're communists, we're familiar with the enclosures, we're familiar with colonization plenty, and we're familiar with the exploitation of women, but to put it back into the context of history where we are seeing those other two things and saying this is just as critical a component is really, really, really important, I think. And I love the way she says that. It's one of her critiques of Marx. On page 13.
Yep.
You know the one. Mm-hmm. I should add that Marx could never have presumed that capitalism paves way to human liberation had he looked at its history from the viewpoint of women. For this history shows that even when men achieved a certain degree of formal freedom, women were always treated as socially inferior beings and were exploited in ways similar to slavery. And I think that's just really it. There is some misogyny in Marx. It's unavoidable, right? Maybe it's historical, maybe whatever. That's not the point here. The point is that the violence imposed upon women for the creation of these hierarchies and the creation of these power structures was just as important to the development of capitalism as the things Marx was writing about.
100%. And another kind of global thing that really stood out to me, being a philosophy nerd, is when she gets into the kind of philosophical theory of particularly Descartes and Hobbes, and how Cartesian dualism and Hobbes's response to that were also, I wouldn't say to blame, but how they're woven into this kind of underlying narrative that continued to undermine bodily autonomy for women, and reinforcing this notion that women are a capitalist commodity of reproduction, literally of reproduction. Yeah. The machine that reproduces to create workers for capitalism, being buoyed by this philosophical theory of, say, Descartes' attitude of the mind over the body. I don't know, I got really into that, and she draws a really interesting argument throughout about the body that is probably the other thing that stood out the most to me, about attitudes toward bodily autonomy and how the shifting of those attitudes manifested throughout history as a response to this kind of changing attitude of what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a woman in society.
Yeah, to me, it's part of that discussion of like everything is political, because she talks a lot about just the idea of rationality, of the scientific method and the way that those things were used, just as we talked about before in Beyond Nature, right? To control, to confine, and to exploit. Right? It's not necessarily that these things are value neutral. It's that undercurrent, like you were saying, right? It's not necessarily that it was the root cause, but it was, what did she say? The bricolage, right? It's like a scaffolding underneath that allowed for these systems to develop on top of it. It's not necessarily that, the development of the scientific method was based on the persecution of women, except when Francis Bacon says that the scientific method was based on the interrogation of the witches in the witch trials. You know what I mean? So there is more of a connection there, where I think that if you wanted to take a more separated scientific look at technological progress, say, you might not see.
Yeah. Also, just a quick note for the English nerds out there. I went through this whole book and she doesn't mention Arthur Miller until the very end. And I was like waiting the whole time, charged up. I used to teach the Crucible years and years ago. And I've always loved this line from John Proctor, peace, it is a providence and no great change. We are what we always were, but naked now. And it's so fucking good in that play. And I was waiting this whole time for her to bust that out because it was so appropriate for so many of the arguments that she was making. She only mentions him at the very, very end of the text, which I thought was funny. But
well, I think that there's something interesting to be said about the fact that the Salem witch trials are the witch trials that prevail.
That's exactly correct. When I hear witch trials, I think of Salem. I don't think of Europe.
Right. And the focus of the witch trials in this book are almost not 100%. She does a lot to talk about, the witch trials in the New World and the way that spirituality is weaponized in nations that we are quote unquote developing. But the main scope of the witch trials in this book is in Europe, where hundreds of thousands of women were executed through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries.
Yep.
As she says, it is something that has been erased from history almost on purpose, right? We've moved past it. We've put the hierarchy into place so firmly that we can now look back at this war that was waged and said, oh, that was superstitious fervor, or that was, religious excessiveness, or even if it was, or even some historians might say it was contextually appropriate given the times. And the Salem witch trials are the ones that stay.
At least for us here in the U.S. Yeah,
that's true, yes. So I had some kind of broad ideas here. One has to do in the beginning with the transition from slavery into serfdom. And the quote that really comes to my mind here is one on 65. And it is from Docs. I don't know who that is. Slavery is that form towards which the master always strives. And I just had the thought that society is the continuation of slavery by other means. Or I should say capitalist society, or society as it has developed. It is not that other possibilities weren't there, as is evident in this book. This is not any different from a typical Marxist view. The structures that are put into place are there to create the most maximum amounts of exploitation possible. And at the end of the day, ultimately, that is slavery. You know what I mean? We're recreating slavery by other means. And I think the transition from slavery to serfdom in this book really lays that out. Let me go to that page, 23. Because I think in this development, you can see the purpose of the state really start to spring forth into action in history. And I'm just looking on page 23 here. Serfdom developed in Europe between the 5th and 7th centuries AD in response to the breakdown of the slave system on which the economy of Imperial Rome had been built. The result was two phenomenons. The new Germanic states, the landlords had to grant slaves the right of plots of land, or else they'd have flight into the bush. At the same time, landlords subjugated the free peasants who ruined the expansion of slave labor, and later the Germanic invasions turned the lords' protection. Okay, that's not super important, but the thing is that the purpose of the state in that system is to ensure the reproduction of itself. Slavery was unable to reproduce itself because of the expansion of the Roman Empire. That's not a history I am familiar with, so, don't come at me. And you see the state put measures into place to try to contain its reproduction. That is not necessarily possible in the same way, and what you see is a qualitative shift, right, from slavery into systems of serfdom. Mm-hmm. No longer do we have explicit slavery, although it's pretty damn explicit. We now have serfdom, right? And then in the later transition from serfdom into capitalism, you see the same reproduction crisis. Serfdom is unable to replicate itself, and so the state, starts moving its levers for reproductive capacity and puts into place all of these hierarchies and systems that then allow for the reproduction to continue. However, qualitatively, it's changed into something else because now we have a wage market. Now we have all of this accumulated surplus. Mm-hmm. Now we're looking at capitalism. What I'm saying is that it's an echo. We are currently seeing a kind of reproduction crisis. Capitalism is struggling to find ways to reproduce itself. And so, in the same sense, I think that studying this history allows us to see better the transition from serfdom into capitalism. It might also set the stage for us to see, kind of moving forward, the ways in which the current crisis of capitalism can lead into other things. And that's a very open-ended question, but it's just one of the things that came to my mind because I really appreciated the way that she shows the fact that the way the systems changed were due to the fact that they were unable to replicate themselves under the current conditions. The contradictions had become so strained that there was a forcible change that happened. Whether that's action from the ground up or reaction from the state down. You can really see, I think, the way the state acts as a tool for the ruling class to continue its rule in those transitions.
Hey everybody, Editor Aaron here, just jumping in to say that I did what I often do, which is get hyper-focused on one thing Will said and then miss the forest for the trees. I just want to draw attention to the point that he's making here. I think it's super, super valid, talking about the current reproduction crisis. And the things that I would like to throw in on that are obviously, AI changing the landscape of work forcibly against the will of the people, destroying the environment of the process. Obviously, there's an end to that crisis that is not good for the people, which is only going to exacerbate that kind of growing class divide, pricing people out of life, where 5 people own more wealth than the bottom 5 billion of the rest of us combined. So certainly, looking at this era in history, like Federici does, could maybe provide some insight for us here in the modern day. What do you know? Okay, that's it. Bye. I don't know that I'm going to be able to string this together, but I would agree. And I think the example that she brings up relating to the kind of shifting relations around peasants and relating that to the shifting relations of women is pretty interesting. So to your point, right under the bit that you read from 23, she mentions that a new class relation is forced to develop because it is necessary to homogenize the conditions of former slaves and free agricultural workers, which is how you come to the peasantry or serfs, right? That's the way the serfdom is created.
Right. And not only that, just to interject, serfdom was the norm. Like it was, if you were a peasant, you were a serf. Much in the same way later, how white becomes associated with free, black becomes associated with slave. We're creating a full societal association of the classes with these ideas.
Yeah, and I don't want to skip over all the body as machine stuff, but in that, she also puts together this argument saying that in the 16th and 17th centuries, land privatization and the commodification of social relations, the response of lords and merchants to their economic crisis, caused widespread poverty, mortality, and an intense resistance that threatened to shipwreck the emerging capitalist economy. And for the changes which the advent of capitalism introduced in the social position of women, especially at the proletarian level, whether in Europe or America, were primarily dictated by the search for new sources of labor as well as new forms of regimentation and division of the workforce. So you see this same sort of homogenization or transformation, metamorphosis, whatever you want to call it, of the social relation around peasantry. Women become subjugated as a means of finding a new form of labor that's lost once that form of serfdom or enslavement or whatever is starting to go out of vogue. You know what I mean? Or move.
Yeah, totally. She says that the commons are enclosed, women become the new commons.
Yes.
In an interesting parallel, all of the peasant rebellions that happen, it's not that they end, but their severity decreases because that same kind of commons is shifted, right? Where the exploitation is shifted to the colonies instead. It's interesting how these others are propped up by the state as an outlet. An outlet for the exploitation that would be happening. It's not that they've shifted the burden of the exploitation onto the women, but they've shifted society's expectation of burden onto the women. It's not that men didn't suffer, right? There is, in a sense, a male witch hunt that happens in the text of this book, and it's all of the persecution of non-working males, right? It's the persecution of vagabonds. Thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of men were hung for being, lazy or not integrating into the wage system, right? Or taking on vagabondage, right? They risk the gallows rather than work for the wage. That's what Silvia Federici says in here. And the thing is that that's still, a horrible crime or whatever you want to call it. But the difference is that in the witch hunts, they were changing the social structure. They were changing the expectation, right? Who is to receive punishment for the sins of humanity, right? The Antichrist within every man, as is quoted in here. And it's shifted from men onto women, right? And then later on, it shifted from the proletariat of Europe to the proletariat of the New World, in further divisions into the women of the proletariat of the New World as well.
Yeah. I don't know where to go from there.
No, I don't know. I mean, that's really the thing, is that this book really lays it out so clearly. I've had a lot of discomfort in the past thinking about history in stages because it seems too prescriptive. It's like first we did slavery, then we did serfdom, then we did capitalism. That's where the history of this book really comes into play. And it's because you can really see that it was a struggle. Almost immediately she says, it's right at the beginning, man. Capitalism was the response of the feudal lords, the patrician merchants, the bishops, and the popes to a centuries-long social conflict that in the end shook their power and truly gave all the world a big jolt. Capitalism was the counter-revolution that destroyed the possibilities that had emerged from the anti-feudal struggle. And it's like, putting it in the context of counter-revolution, I think, is so powerful here, because you're saying, like, it's not a prescriptive set of stages. It's not an evolution of society. It is a constant struggle. It is a class struggle, right? We're talking about the fact that women's history is class history. That's the driving force behind all of history, just like Marx said, and before, my discomfort from looking at it in stages is missing that struggle or not seeing all of the aspects of that struggle throughout history, right? There were still blank spots in my historical conception where I couldn't see that struggle in the same light. And I think a huge part of that, which is the purpose of this book, is to show that a big part of that struggle was the struggle against women and women's bodies.
Yeah, she lays out very early in the introduction kind of two ways that she's going to move away from Marx's traditional conception of the transition into capitalism. On page 12, she tells us the two parts. She says, my analysis departs from Marx's in two ways. Whereas Marx examines primitive accumulation from the viewpoint of the waged male proletariat and the development of commodity production, I examine it from the viewpoint of the changes it introduced in the social position of women and the production of labor power. And then further down, she says, giving us the second way, my analysis also departs from Marx's in its evaluation of the legacy and function of primitive accumulation. There can be no doubt that he viewed it as a necessary step in the process of human liberation, but it's important to note that it is written in the annals of humanity in characters of fire and blood. Talking of Marx, he assumed that the violence that had presided over the earliest phases of capitalist expansion would recede with the maturing of capitalist relations, when the exploitation and disciplining of labor would be accomplished mostly through the workings of economic laws. In this, he was deeply mistaken. The violence is going to escalate, she tells us. This is a very, very violent occurrence that's happening. It's not like you said, a clean, prescriptive one stage to the other. There's a whole history of violence here, and that history of violence is largely predicated on patriarchal, misogynistic violence against women. And as Federici makes clear, since that violence is based on the embedded subjugation of women, their bodies, and the natural extension of that one single logic that she mentioned before, that also commands imperialist endeavors abroad, that violence can do nothing but escalate over time, not recede, as Marx says.
She does make this point, but, Marx says that violence is the midwife, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Force is the midwife here of history, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's telling, guys.
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah, and another thing that I really appreciate, too, is that it's not all history. She comes back again and again to the fact that so many of these aspects of primitive accumulation or original accumulation, whatever you want to say, they are still facets of society that exist today. It's just that, much like how the exploitation was shifted from Europe to the colonies, we're looking at these same kind of prescriptions just applied onto the New World. And the thing is that the results are the same. We still see an escalation of violence in women when it comes to the privatization of land, say, in Africa. Something that I really appreciated in the introduction of the preface, I can't remember which, is she talks about her time working in Nigeria, where, I think it was in the 80s or 90s, where the World Bank came in and said, you have to do these structural adjustments. And what she saw was a parallel to the same kind of primitive accumulation tactics that she was writing about.
Yep.
And I think that is so revealing. We're still taking these same prescriptions of capital and applying them to places which we think are not capitalistically developed. And part of that comes with enclosure. Part of that comes with colonization. And part of that comes with the exploitation of women.
Yeah, there's a quote on page 9, the quote that you're speaking of there. The declared purpose of the program was to make Nigeria competitive on the international market, but it was soon apparent that this involved a new round of primitive accumulation and a rationalization of social reproduction aimed at destroying the last vestiges of communal property and community relations, and thereby impose more intense forms of labor exploitation. Thus I saw unfolding under my eyes processes very similar to those I had studied in preparation for Il Grande Caliban. Oh, sorry. For this book. Among them were the attacks on communal lands and a decisive intervention by the state instigated by the World Bank in the reproduction of the workforce to regulate procreation rates and, in this case, reduce the size of a population that was deemed too demanding and too indisciplined from the viewpoint of the prospective insertion of the global economy. And it's like, I don't have a complete thought around this, but so much of her analysis is, to me, caught up in this idea that women are the body, like literally and figuratively are the body that produce the necessary means to see capitalism thrive. And that is why, partially, why they are so hyper exploited in that sense. Why the social relations around femininity have been shifted through violence and through subjugation, domination, intentionally to create this conception of femininity that is kind to capitalism, for lack of a better term, you know? So much of what she writes about the body and bodily autonomy is just wrapped up in this, that like after the Black Plague and they needed workers.
Yeah, the golden age of the proletariat, man, or the peasant, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm too dumb to have a complete thought about it, but it's just stuck with me through the whole reading that the conclusion is yet to be made.
Yeah. The thing is that it seems so clear when you look at it through this lens, right? Especially if we think about, like, just as I was saying earlier, the state is the tool of the ruling class to ensure its rule, right? To ensure that its systems stay in place. Those are systems of reproduction, the systems that reproduce society. And the thing is that when we're talking about the reproduction of the system, we're talking about literal reproduction here.
Yeah.
So it's so hand in hand with the reproduction of society that, of course, if we're living under a capitalist society, then we should expect reproduction to be regulated by capitalism. How could it not be directed at women at the end of the day?
Yeah, because they are the responsible party. They are the agent that literally creates labor power.
Yeah. So it's just, I don't know, like, why is it so hidden otherwise? Just straight up misogyny?
That's I guess maybe part of where my struggle comes with, like, having a clear, it feels so self-evident in hindsight. You read this and it's like, no fucking duh.
Carissa read this book also, and I had the pleasure of seeing her notes. And there were a couple times where she just wrote, duh.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm like, yeah, it really should be obvious, you know? I shouldn't have to read this book to figure these kinds of things out.
Yeah. But it's just in the reading, all of these things are clicking in place that make so much sense, that are so obviously missing in hindsight. You know what I mean? It's a fucking great book.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a damn shame that I only heard about this book for the first time like last year.
Yeah.
You know, I think this is a really good one. I mean, especially because, just as she says in the beginning, part of the legwork that you have to do as a Marxist is to kind of understand how we got to this, right? And the transition to capitalism is a big part of that. You just have to have the complete picture. And women are a big part of that. Go women!
They hold
this
up
one's
half
for
the
you,
sky.
ladies. Yeah, they hold up half the sky, exactly. As Joe Biden said.
I'm going to have the most to say about some commentary on the body as a factory.
Sure.
So I would be interested to jump into that. Federici first mentions this on page 16, very early on, laying the groundwork here, where she writes, "The body has been for women in capitalist society what the factory has been for male-waged workers, the primary ground of their exploitation and resistance, as the female body has been appropriated by the state and men and forced to function as a means for the reproduction and accumulation of labor. Further, it explains how the body can be for women both a source of identity and at the same time a prison, and why it is so important for feminists and at the same time so problematic to valorize it." And she goes on, or I'm sorry, even before that, I guess, is where she's talking about a problem with modern feminist studies in that they, quote, revalorize the body. Mm-hmm. And, you know, had I read this book before we got through Capital, I don't know that I would have interpreted that phrase in exactly the same way. But I'm thinking about valorization now in a purely Marxist sense. And so, like, to see this criticism of modern feminists where she says, "Indeed, the many feminist studies which have been produced since the early 1970s on the policing of women's reproductive function, the effects on women of rape, battering, and the imposition upon them of beauty as a condition for social acceptability are a monumental contribution to the discourse on the body in our times, falsifying the perception common among academics which attributes its discovery to Michel Foucault, and that feminists have not only revolutionized the contemporary philosophical and political discourse, but they have also begun to revalorize the body." I see that as a criticism. I'm not sure that she means it entirely as a criticism, because there is this kind of dialectic thing with the body that she mentions there, where it is both a source of identity and at the same time a prison for women.
Yeah.
So there's this really interesting tension that she develops, I feel, as she continues to kind of work through the history of the reframing of femininity and womanhood through this lens of capitalist exploitation and the expropriation of labor power from women's reproductive power.
Yeah.
You know?
That tension, that alienation from the body, which is obviously at once a source of independence and agency, is also simultaneously turned into a machine for the generation of capital. And that's for the capitalist, not even for the inhabitant of the body. That has many implications for modern feminist discourse, specifically around discussions of things like sexual repression, bodily autonomy as it relates to reproduction or transness, sexual expression, you know?
Well, I think that the most interesting conversation to be had about the revalorization of the body comes from the conversation around sex work. The way that we talk about sex work in this day and age, like, it's not that it's a moral framework necessarily, but the idea of like body autonomy, like OnlyFans, you know, like you have self-autonomy to sell your own body, you know what I mean? Like it's that same kind of idea there where it's a source of identity, it's a source of empowerment in a sense, but at the same time, you're still in the prison of capitalism, you're still in the prison of a wage. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know, I think there's just something really interesting because the body does, like, this is kind of the current that runs throughout a lot of this, is that there are elements of empowerment within a lot of these things, but very quickly they are recuperated. You know, and I think that that's much the same. Like, the body should be a source of empowerment, but if you're doing sex work, you're still doing work. I don't know if that really fully fleshes out what I'm trying to say here, but that's just kind of where my mind goes when we're talking about like a current body politic. Even in a sense like the pussy hat stuff. You know, it's like such a focus on the body specifically. There's almost something essentialist about it. I don't know. I'm this is too blurry for me, I think.
No, I'm with you all the way on all of that. I think the conversation around sex work is complicated and changes depending on your audience.
Yeah.
But I think your point is exactly correct. There's nothing inherently denigrating about sex work that isn't denigrating about all forms of work under capitalism. And so the problem, the criticism of sex work is largely from society at large, not from communists or whatever.
Yeah.
The criticism of sex work is largely a moral one, which comes from the changing social relations that Federici kind of mentions here as the kind of attitudes toward women and sexuality shift over time. There's some really interesting stuff in the book where she kind of talks about the policing of the female body coming from a means of controlling men.
Dude, I mean, the whole section, especially when you think about the puritanical idea of women, to see what came before it, especially what was institutionalized and sponsored by society, is really crazy. I mean, on page 47.
Oh, shit, I was right here. I was looking at the church and prostitution. I was on the next page.
Yeah, it's hand in hand here, right? By the end of the 15th... What?
I'm sorry, my note is just turn them into gooners. What a fucking idiot.
There, dude, you're beating me to the point here.
Sorry.
By the end of the 15th century, a counter-revolution was already underway at every level of social and political life. First, efforts were made by the political authorities to co-opt the youngest and most rebellious male workers by means of a vicious sexual politics that gave them access to free sex and turned class antagonism into antagonism against proletarian women. That sounds kind of familiar. In France, the municipal authorities practically decriminalized rape, providing the victims were women of the lower classes. She says another aspect of the diverse sexual politics was that the princes and municipal authorities pursued to diffuse workers' protests was the institutionalization of prostitution, implemented through the opening of municipal brothels soon proliferating throughout Europe. Enabled by the contemporary high-wage regime, state-managed prostitution was seen as a useful remedy for the turbulence of proletarian youth who in La Grande Maison, as the state brothel was called in France, could enjoy a privilege previously reserved for older men.
Yeah.
And just to give some numbers to that, she says that between 1350 and 1450, publicly managed tax-financed brothels were opened in every town and village in Italy and France, in numbers far superior to those reached in the 19th century. Amiens alone had 53 brothels in 1453.
Yeah. Yeah. And she goes on to say in the next paragraph there, after saying that prostitution was officially recognized as a public service, that even the church came to see prostitution as a legitimate activity. The state-managed brothel was believed to provide an antidote to the orgiastic sexual practices of the heretic sects.
Sects.
Yeah. And to be a remedy for sodomy as well as a means to protect family life. So there's this weaponization of sex work, not necessarily as a weaponization against women, but as a weaponization against class solidarity. It's a means of class warfare to sow the seeds of discontent, or no, to what's the opposite of sow? Yeah, to quiet the discontent that might be happening in the working class because they're too sexed up.
Yeah.
And she says, not making light of this at all, but it's almost like a state-backed sexual assault where it's like so rampant, so allowed, so the attitude toward it is so
normalized.
Yeah, permissive, that there's this very clear undermining of women at all, and also just of like bodily autonomy as a concept.
Sure.
So these things are like under the surface of what is happening intentionally, but those will continue to be carried through history just like everything else.
I mean, all I have to say here is OnlyFans, man. The fact that so many young men think of OnlyFans woman as it's like that's now a broad category for women. It's like you're an OnlyFans model, and I think it's the same kind of strategy. It's just not as top-down directed as, or it's not explicitly top-down directed as we see here. I don't know. It's just another parallel to modern sex work that I feel is pretty strong here. The opportunities that are still available to women are... Like, it seems ridiculous to say out loud because it's completely obvious, but like the opportunities that we push women into societally taint people's view on women. OnlyFans is a great example, and it's a reflection of the same kind of thing that was happening here back in fucking 1453.
Yeah. Have you ever read any John Stoltenberg?
Mm-mm.
Okay. The book that I have of his that I liked a lot is called Refusing to be a Man. Shout out to Propagandy for putting me on to John Stoltenberg back in the day. But he has an abolitionist attitude, I guess is the word you'd say it, toward pornography, largely for this reason. And additionally, because pornography has a tendency to not be shaped by the misogyny of society, but to shape the misogyny of society, where, the attitude toward women in pornography, traditional pornography, this isn't like cam model pornography.
We're not talking about art stuff here.
Well, no, I mean, like, OnlyFans is, I guess, when I think of that, I guess I'm thinking of like solo cam stuff. It's a little, the attitudes are different in it, I guess.
I mean, maybe in the beginning, but now it's just a fucking...
Is it the same?
It's just a paid pornography service.
Okay. I don't know. I mean, I've always been very uncomfortable with pornography in general because of I've always felt that it exacerbates attitudes of violence toward women. And
hard to argue with.
Yeah. Well, and Stoltenberg makes that same sort of argument, right? Like, his argument is not that pornography is a reflection of the misogyny of society. It's that pornography shapes the misogyny of society, and it just continues to push the boundaries further and further along, which is why, like, I don't know, like choking and things like that are, I don't want to yuck anybody's yum, do whatever you want to do to get your jollies as long as it's consensual. But like, you have to examine, let me say it this way. Let me not.
There's a deeper examination of fetish required.
Yeah. I mean, like, things like that don't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
I don't know.
This is not a tangent we need to get into, but I think that there's something really interesting to be said about the fact that those kinds of things stem from the other. They stem from exploitation in that same sense. I mean, like...
There's a desensitization to violence against women that comes as a natural extension of things like that happen in pornography.
It's a continuation of slavery by other means.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we can leave it at that.
Well said. There's more about the body. We went off of that very quickly. I'm sorry. I want to jump to 91 because the first thing that when I was reading this, the first like kind of oh wow moment that I had was Federici making the argument that the female body is the first machine of capitalist production. And she says here on the top of 91, the female body was turned into an instrument for the reproduction of labor and the expansion of the workforce, treated as a natural breeding machine, functioning according to rhythms outside of women's control. This aspect of primitive accumulation is absent in Marx's analysis, except for his remarks in the Communist Manifesto on the use of women within the bourgeois family as producers of heirs, guaranteeing the transmission of family property. Marx never acknowledged that procreation could become a terrain of exploitation and, by the same token, a terrain of resistance. Why procreation should be a fact of nature rather than a social, historically determined activity invested by diverse interests and power relations is a question Marx did not ask. And she goes on to build this into a description of alienation from one's own body that really blew me away. I'll say it in two parts. But even later, down to the present, the state has spared no efforts in its attempt to wrench from women's hands the control over reproduction and determine which children should be born, where, when, or in what numbers. No one can describe, in fact, the anguish and desperation suffered by a woman seeing her body turned against herself, as it must occur in the case of an unwanted pregnancy. That's terrible. I appreciate her framing of that. I think that it puts into words something that undergirds, the feminist argument for bodily autonomy with reproductive rights, right? But explains it in a way that makes sense, even if you're not fucking with that kind of abstract philosophical notion of autonomy, right? Like bodily autonomy. That there is like a real material, concrete reason why that is a problem. That being the denying of an individual the rights over their own body, right?
Something to add to that, too, is that I think that the sentence, consequently, women have been forced to procreate against their will, is much broader than it even seems on its face. And it's because there's a societal expectation on women to procreate. Against their will is a very deep statement when you think about it, because their will is formed by the society around them. And if we've structured society towards the procreation of women for the reproduction of capitalism, then is their will really their will in that same sense? I mean, it's very like true will, very... Like when we read Marcuse, he talked a lot about the truth in that sense. And I think that there's something really load-bearing there, because we structure society in a way that tells women they need to reproduce. There is a biological aspect of it where you have to procreate in order to continue the survival of the species or whatever. But the whole structure is geared towards that thing,
Yeah. The social pressures to have children.
Yeah.
It's astounding to me. I mean, we talked a little bit about kids on the show, I guess, previously.
In the mines. Yeah.
No, I mean like about having children.
Yes.
I don't know if any of that's... I don't remember how much of that has made the show.
I need more field workers, so I need more kids.
Well, I mean, legitimately, that was a thing for a while. You know what I mean? And she even gets to that, like talking about the shifting of how one's labor used to always be for the sustenance of oneself and one's family. And then, that got repurposed to becoming labor for others. And that shifts the kind of dynamic of the family and obviously shifts our attitude toward children and women.
Well, even in the shift in birth of the focus to the fetus instead of the focus towards the mother.
Yeah.
For the survival of the fetus. I think it's the same exact kind of thing.
Yeah. It's tough. Shout out, man. It's fucking tough to talk back to that kind of pressure. It makes one wonder what in a post-capitalist world discussions around or attitudes around reproduction, what they will look like. If there's no longer... Let me jump to the book. On 135, Federici says... There is an attempt to form a new type of individual that the bourgeoisie engages in battle against the body that has become its historic mark. According to Max Weber, the reform of the body is at the core of the bourgeois ethic because capitalism makes acquisition the ultimate purpose of life, instead of treating it as a means for the satisfaction of our needs. Thus, it requires that we forfeit all spontaneous enjoyment of life. Capitalism also attempts to overcome our natural state. What she's talking around here is that capitalism's demand of ownership of the body, specifically the body of a worker, right? But that entails, by extension, the ownership of a birthing person's body because they are the one that is birthing the worker, right? So with that pressure gone, if we are in a post-capitalist world where we are no longer facing the pressures of capitalism to continue to reproduce workers, because we already live in a world of abundance, hopefully our world in the future will be one framed around sustainability, so a degrowth model, What is that social relation going to look like around reproduction? It's a natural consequence of another thing that people like to do a lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, so I think that there's an answer somewhere within the creation of the family. If we want to talk about what that looks like, you look like what an actual natural state of reproduction looks like, and that might be something found in indigenous communities. I'm thinking specifically about when they talk about the French going to Canada and teaching the Indians how to beat their children, which it's not the most horrid thing in this book, but it is certainly a soul-wrenching thing.
Yeah, and the great irony of someone considering themselves to be morally superior going in and teaching them to beat their kids.
Yeah. But the whole thing there is like, the French only see your children. We think of them as our children. Like there is a possibility for society in which reproduction is not a matter of the state at all. That's what we're talking about ultimately here, is that the state is taking reproduction into its own hands because it is necessary for the process of reproduction.
Yeah, the propagation of the state.
Yeah, the state understands that part of its survival is the control of reproductive practices. If we're talking about an ideal post-capitalist world, then ideally speaking, that kind of reproduction would not be something that has to be worried about by the state at all. Especially if we're talking about something that's like post-scarcity, ideally, right? Or we're talking about something where the ability for people to be made societally to give birth is not a requirement of our continuation of labor production, And that could be a lot of things, even in a sense, like if you want to talk crazy, like in replicators, if we have like technology to a point where we don't require humans to do all of the labor, then the regulation of the population of humanity is not necessarily going to be viewed in the same way. It might be viewed in a sustainability way, but I don't think it'll be viewed in the same way of a reproduction of production.
Bodies, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I wonder... The other part of this that is kind of framing my thinking is I'm thinking a lot about communalism, and forgive me if I'm going to misquote something I haven't read, but my understanding is that a lot of Kollontai theory is around the communal attitude toward the rearing of children.
Sure.
And so there's maybe an answer there, but also Federici says, where's that line? It's on page 24, way back when, warns us that communalism doesn't necessarily equate to egalitarianism,
Right.
She says, talking about medieval servile communities, I guess. They fell short of these goals and should not be idealized as an example of communalism. In fact, its example reminds us that neither communalism nor localism can be a guarantee of egalitarian relations unless the community controls its means of subsistence and all its members have equal access to them. Well, I guess in a post-capitalist world, theoretically, we would have met those two preconditions.
There's a really interesting parallel that comes later in the colonial chapters, and it is on page 226. Right at the end. Yeah, well, I spotted it because she's talking about, this is in the Andes, the conquistadors during the conquest. In Peru as well, the first large-scale attack on diabolism occurred in the 1560s, coinciding with the rise of the Taki-Onkoi movement, a native millenarian movement that preached against collaboration with Europeans and a pan-Andean alliance of the local gods. The threat posed by the Taki-Onkos was a serious one, since by calling for pan-Andean unification of the Huacas, the movement marked the beginning of a new sense of identity capable of overcoming the divisions connected in the traditional organization of the Ayllus. And we actually have heard about that before, way back when we read Guerrilla Warfare, because Joseph Maria Tegui, the Peruvian Marxist, or pre-Marxist, had an idea of indigenous communalism based on that system, the Ayllus system. And so that's where I clocked it, right? Just as she's saying back on 24, it's falling short of those goals because we're looking at a place where members have equal access to them. She's saying that the possibility of collaboration in the Andes came from the fact that they were overlooking those initial divisions. We're moving past that sense. It's almost like an evolution, right? Like maybe a reform of the system, so it's not necessarily that like we're looking back at these indigenous communalists as like the perfect ideal, but as a baseline, if we're talking about a better way to look at it is this, right? Like those systems could have developed into something more egalitarian had there not been the counter-revolution of the feudal manor, had there not been the counter-revolution of the pre-capitalist class. And so I just think that there's something interesting to be said there because there's just something there in alternative systems that we fucking destroyed. I have a little topic here. It's just the fact that, man, reading any history pre-1700s, it really makes you realize how small Christianity really is. This is just one system that fucking jumped out and beat the rest of them down. There's no like full natural truth or whatever, word of God, any of that stuff. When you read this history, you can see so clearly that like the Christian church was one of many, and even more so than that, it was just another extension of the ruling class. It was another extension of class exploitation, of class power, of class domination. And it's just like so stark when you start seeing Christianity put in perspective compared to other religions at the time. Like when she talks about the heretics in this book, I think it's really intriguing because like the positioning of heretical sects, it's an othering thing, you know, like, and it puts Christianity front and center. And the thing is that it's just one of many. It's not central. Christianity is not some fucking huge monolithic power coming from God or anything like that. It's just a bunch of guys in robes that are doing exploitation like the rest of them.
Yeah.
And it's just so evident when you read about the church in the fucking 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries that it is like mind breaking, you know, especially if you're someone who has grown up with like a real sense of religious righteousness or maybe like a strong affinity for the church. Looking back at the history of the church, especially the Christian church, is like really damning. It's crazy. And it's for the same exact purposes, the same scripture passages. I don't know how people can... There's a fucking dissonance there that I can't quite stomach.
I'm with you 100% on that.
We're on the same page here, obviously. But it's just something I felt really strongly because, I don't know, I feel like if you were a real devout Christian and you had never heard any of this stuff before, it would be really shattering. But I know that that's not the case. You know what I mean? Like, I know that that's not the truth.
Yeah, unfortunately, it seems hard truths like that are often not regarded with the gravity that they should be.
Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to say, because the church is omnipresent throughout this book. She talks so much about the ways that the church is an extension of class rule and the way that the authorities use the church to recondition the way we view women in society and the way we recondition women's labor in society. I mean, there's really just so much of this book that's interconnected. You should read it.
Absolutely. There was one really good quote about the body that I wanted to close that section with, if that's okay.
Yeah, by all means.
There's this great quote on 92. Here I only want to stress that by denying women control over their bodies, the state deprived them of the most fundamental condition for physical and psychological integrity and degraded maternity to the status of forced labor, in addition to confining women to reproductive work in a way unknown in previous societies. Nevertheless, forcing women to procreate against their will, or as a feminist song from the 1970s had it, forcing them to produce children for the state, only in part defined women's function in the new sexual division of labor. A complementary aspect was the definition of women as non-workers, a process much studied by feminist historians, which by the end of the 17th century was nearly completed. And maybe that is facilitates a good transition to the next topic, which is the kind of devaluing of domestic labor. Because she does spend a little bit of time on that. Even on this same page, as Mary Weisner, among others, tells us, the assumption was gaining ground in the law, in the tax records, in the ordinances of the guilds, that women should not work outside the home and should engage in production only in order to help their husbands. It was even argued that any work that women did at home was non-work and was worthless even when done for the market. Which is just absurd because she even goes through a lot of the history. There's a part where she's pointing out the history of a lot of the guilds in England, saying that 80% of them had female members.
Yeah.
It was very clear that women and their labor was valued at one time, but there was a very clear shift in the kind of social relation that deliberately devalued their work in order to force them into this kind of box of domestication so they would reproduce.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, you can see it in the way that, you know, a lot of traditionally women-centered industries became male-centered. I mean, women were traditionally ale brewers. You don't really think of brewmasters as women. That's a consequence of that. I mean, this is very much more explicit, but much in the same way that women were pushed out of obstetrics, you know, and men were put in that place. The midwife was excluded from the birthing room, from the delivery room, very quickly into this process.
Yeah.
You know, and it's part of that same thing. The state was exercising its control over reproduction.
Am I remembering it rightly that she, even in her retelling of the history of the witch hunts in Europe, talks about midwifery and the kind of reframing of that as an almost magical thing to lump them in with?
I think so. She does mention it, that midwives were often accused of being witches. When she starts talking about who was getting the accusations of witchcraft, midwives were very often accused, especially because when babies died, women were blamed, you know, regardless.
Well, the other part of that is that midwives were granted tremendous access societally, like they were in
and out of homes all across. So there was
true.
a part of it there, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much of like just objective control of women put in place by the state. I mean, like the descriptions of, women in Germany not being able to live alone or with each other in the New World, where the laws were put into place where women had to follow their husbands into the mining camps and shit, even though it was full of poisonous gas and stuff. It's like a fate worse than death, she says. I mean, it's just really telling. I mean, it's really on the nose.
Yeah. I mean, again, another very self-evident thing. On 98, there's a couple of things that she's stringing together here in her argument about the devaluing of domestic work and the reframing of women as non-workers, instead socially defining women in the terms of mother, wife, daughter, widow, things like that.
Yes.
She goes on 98 to say that this is all part of a deliberate intention to exclude women from wage work so they would become effectively slaves of this kind of patriarchal order, right? What stands out in this type of arrangement is that though the wife worked side by side with her husband, she too producing for the market, it was the husband who now received her wage. In England, a married man was legally entitled to his wife's earnings, registering the payment made in the men's names. This policy, making it impossible for women to have money on their own, created the material conditions for their subjection to men and the appropriation of their labor by male workers. It is in this sense that I speak of the patriarchy of the wage.
Yeah.
Which is another one of her books that I bought, by the way. So if we want to read that for the show, we
nice.
can. But it's astounding for anyone that doesn't know that this financial independence, when were women fully granted financial independence? Because it might astound you to know that it is in your lifetime that women were able to apply for credit on their own. Have their own bank accounts.
I was just about to say, part of the reason my mom kept her maiden name when she married my dad was for that exact reason. Her previous husband, she could not have her own bank account.
Yep.
You can correct me if I'm wrong, Mom. Sorry.
But we're talking...
that was 50 years ago. Like,
the 70s.
It was not,
we're talking about the 70s. 1970s.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's so funny because I was just thinking about that really dumb fuck argument in the wage gap discourse that happened probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago at this point, where men were angry. They're like, the women's wage gap doesn't exist, blah, blah, blah. All of that shit. There was a really dumb right-wing argument that was like, if women truly got paid less than men, then every worker would just be a woman. Everyone would just hire women since you could pay them less. And I think it's really tremendously funny because that exact thing happens here in the 13th or 14th century, whenever, because the men of the guilds vote to exclude women because they're afraid that the capitalists will hire women since they can pay them less.
Yep.
Yeah, it's the patriarchy of the wage, man. It's right there. And not even to say that men necessarily benefited. I mean, surely they did, but they still suffered. They were still exploited. That division was only used to further exploit them also. The capitalist class did that.
Yeah, it's a big club and you ain't in it.
Right, exactly.
As Carlin says, yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I'll add about domestic labor and the devaluing of women and the equating of domestic labor as non-work. There's also intertwined with that some interesting stuff around patriarchal family dynamics on the top of 98.
Yeah.
I guess it starts on 97, but there's also been more interest in the family as a political institution than as a place of work. What has been emphasized then is that in the new bourgeois family, the husband became the representative of the state, charged with disciplining and supervising the subordinate classes, a category that for the 16th and 17th century political theorists included the man's wife and children. Thus, the identification of the family as a microstate or as a microchurch, and the demand by the authorities that single workers live under the roof and rule of a master. It is also pointed out that within the bourgeois family, the woman lost much of her power, being generally excluded from the family business and confined to the supervision of the household. So this top-down hierarchy, which places the father as the master, the mother as the warden or something like that at best, always still a subordinate to the father in the family dynamic. And you see that in every, patriarchal relation of the family that still continues to this day.
Yeah. I did find the quote I was looking for, by the way.
Okay.
And it is on 115. Just to kind of spread it out. This is across a couple of paragraphs. But she says, thus, no less than the international division of labor, the sexual division of labor was above all a power relation, a division within the workforce, while being an immense boost to capital accumulation. In reality, the advantages which the capitalist class derive from the differentiation between agricultural and industrial labor and within industrial labor itself, celebrated in Adam Smith's Ode to Penmaking, pale when compared to those it derived from the degradation of women's work and social position. And then she says, as we have seen, male workers have often been complicitous with this process, as they have tried to maintain their power with respect to capital by devaluing and disciplining women, children, and the populations the capitalist class has colonized. But the power that men have imposed on women by virtue of their access to wage labor and their recognized contribution to capitalist accumulation has been paid at the price of self-alienation and the primitive disaccumulation of their own individual and collective powers.
Yeah.
So just really striking there. I mean, something we didn't mention, a great quote she says very early on is that primitive accumulation was not just the accumulation of labor and capital, but it was also the accumulation of division and difference, right? That division of labor is a process of capitalist development, and that further division helps to intensify the amount of surplus that they can extract from it. It's just that same thing that I was saying earlier, where it's like they're just creating the division. It's divide and conquer.
Yeah. Well, and it's related to this devaluing of domestic work too, because there's in the sublimation of the woman as a domestic laborer that is now doing, quote, non-work, that allows the capitalist the ability to accumulate the labor of women through the accumulation of men in their lives.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
It's like literally like the expectation of the male work is now supplemented by the unpaid women's work. It's invisible. I mean, that's what she says in here, right? And the thing is that it's intensifying the expectation of the men's work, right? A man with a woman at home can produce more than just a solo man, a single man, right? So we're literally intensifying the expected labor. We're intensifying the surplus here by devaluing the women's work. It's the unseen labor. Yeah, I mean...
Well, and it goes back to that thing we were talking about with class warfare also, where she even says here that this serves to deflect class antagonism into an antagonism between men and women. You create this social division between men and women that creates antagonism between them, which deflects from class solidarity, antagonism being pointed upward.
Insidious shit.
I would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the philosophy stuff before we jump into anything else, I guess. So I want to jump into talking about Descartes, Hobbes, and the body. She spends quite a long time looking at these thinkers, starting on 138. So first, just to lay the groundwork, on 138, she's kind of talking through some things that Descartes writes about in Treatise of Man. A basic task of Descartes' enterprise is to institute an ontological divide between a purely mental in a purely physical domain. Every manner, attitude, and sensation is thus defined. Their limits are marked, their possibilities weighed, with such a thoroughness that one has the impression that the book of human nature has been opened for the first time, or more likely that a new land has been discovered and the conquistadors are setting out to chart its paths, compile the list of its natural resources, assess its advantages and disadvantages. So if you know anything about the Cartesian turn in philosophy, you know cogito ergo sum, you know I think therefore I am. This is the foundation of Descartes' dualism, the idea that the mind exists separate from the body and that identity lives in the mind, not in the body. This is, you might not think of the implications of that on a gender politic, so to speak, on a sexual politic, but Federici is going to point some of those things out. Next, though, on 139, she points out Hobbes' position. For Hobbes, the body is a conglomerate of mechanical motions that, lacking autonomous power, operates on the basis of an external causation, in a play of attractions and aversions where everything is regulated as in an automaton. The degradation of the body had a purely negative function, seeking to establish the temporal and illusory nature of earthly pleasures, and consequently the need to renounce the body itself. So we see, regardless of the actual philosophy, a degradation of the body in both of these men's thinking, which is obviously going to have implications down the road when we're talking about bodily autonomy and ownership over one's self. I'm trying to think of a way to wrap this up quickly, but I'll just read another quote. I'm sorry. From 139. This is Federici kind of bringing all of this together. To pose the body as a mechanical matter, void of any intrinsic teleology, the occult virtues attributed to it by both natural magic and the popular superstitions of the time, was to make intelligible the possibility of subordinating it to a work process that increasingly relied on uniform and predictable forms of behavior. If you can separate the body from the soul, right? This would pacify objections to exploitation.
Yeah.
there's obviously some very problematic implications around that. And that also, I was, for whatever reason, in the context of reading this chapter, thinking about religious self-flagellation.
100%. I give up my house on earth for a house in heaven.
Yeah, and it's like that my discomfort with that is coming out here also. There's more. On 148, there's more here about Descartes and Hobbes and their vision of the body and its implications. On the one side, we have the Cartesian model that, starting from the assumption of a purely mechanical body, postulates the possibility of developing in the individual mechanisms of self-discipline, self-management, self-regulation, allowing for voluntary work relations in a government based on consent. On the other side, there's the Hobbesian model that, denying the possibility of a body-free reason, externalizes the functions of command, consigning them to the absolute authority of the state. In both of these cases, there is a problematic implication for women, because Descartes is creating this division, this dualist division between body and spirit. Anything that happens is a personal failing. Any exploitation that occurs is a personal failing because you have not been self-disciplined enough, self-managed enough. You have not properly self-regulated. From the Hobbesian perspective, that there's no such thing as a body-free reason. All of that is external anyway, and so the body is unable to resist. There's like an inability and a presumed unwillingness to resist any sort of subjugation and domination. This is fucked. These are thinkers from the age of reason, the Enlightenment, coming forward and like shaping, what did she call it? The century of geniuses or whatever. And the best fucking thesis they can come up with is like, tough shit, your body is a tool of the state.
Clearly they hadn't read enough Hegel, man, because so seriously, when she objects to the Cartesian dualism because she says there's no push and pull between the mind and the body, and like that's truly the resolution to it. The mind and the body exist in concert with each other. It's not one over the other. There's no master and slave in this.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it is. Just to kind of add on to that, I really love the way on 151 she says that they're resolved. The conflict between Cartesian theism and Hobbesian materialism was to be resolved in time in their reciprocal assimilation, in the sense that, as is always in the history of capitalism, the decentralization of the mechanisms of command through their localization in the individual was finally obtained only to the extent that a centralization occurred in the power of the state. So it's exactly like you're saying. It's like we've built enough of that self-discipline in yourself. That's one end of the spectrum. On the other end, the state has come to such a state of power that conflict is no longer there. We've squared the ideas of the individual with the ideas of the state in that sense. It's not the collective, but the state.
Yeah, and just this, your comment about supremacy really stood out to me, because she mentions on 149 that for the mind, supremacy over the body implies that the will can, in principle, control the needs, reactions, reflexes of the body. It can impose a regular order on its vital functions and force the body to work according to external specifications, independently of its desires. This idea that the mind can control the needs and impulses of the body is absurd, but it is largely still the foundational basis for exploitation of the body in a capitalist system.
I mean, just looking at 149, no spirit, no God, no bishop, no king,
Yeah.
I mean, she quotes Weber throughout this entire thing, but it's totally wrapped up in the Protestant work ethic and capitalism,
Yeah.
Like it's there.
The last thing I'll say to that brings it together on the bottom of 151 there, when she says, the crux of the matter was lucidly expressed by Joseph Glanville, a Cartesian member of the Royal Society, who, in a polemic against Hobbes, argued that the crucial issue was the control of the mind over the body. This, however, did not simply imply the control of the ruling class over the body proletariat, but equally important, the development of the capacity for self-control within the person. And it's just a really fascinating analogy to talk about individuals' mind controlling an individual's body, and then expanding that socially to see the mind, quote, the state, the ruling class ruling over the body proletariat.
Yeah. Well, I think it's funny too, on the page previous, I know we just keep jumping back and forth here, but I suggest that the popularity of Cartesianism among the middle and upper classes was directly related to the program of self-mastery. So it's like seeking of mobility, it's like all I have to do is discipline myself so fully that I can overwhelm these systemic structural things.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yeah, I mean, exactly, and it's like, it's no wonder that was the winning idea there. So, I mean, same with Protestantism. What can I say?
Yeah.
I just make it right with my God, who I have a personal connection with. That came a little later, sorry. Shout out to the Mormons, dude. The most capitalistic version of Christianity possible. And it's so rooted in its individuality. You literally speak to God. You speak to the Holy Spirit.
Sure.
I think there's just something really ironic in the difference in the presentation of women in the era of feudal reaction versus under the control of the Puritans. You know, women are viewed as loose, uncontrollable, lusty, and then under the Puritans, it's like temperate, modest housewife. Carissa has a great note where she just wrote, "These freaks colonized America."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Aaron, again, one last editorial interruption. This is hopefully an unnecessary clarification, but for the sake of precision and veracity, I should make clear that while Will and I are talking about women in sex work due to the nature of this text that we're reading, we, of course, recognize that sex work isn't exclusively the domain of women. Our analysis here is definitely centered on women in sex work, but it's worth noting at least that we know sex work is not only populated by women. You know, just wanted to throw that out there. Back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, so this is kind of wrapped up, and I maybe should have brought it up when we were talking about sex work, but like she brings up this point on 99. Let me just read it. Throughout the first phase of proletarianization, it was the prostitute who often performed for male workers the function of a wife, cooking and washing for them in addition to serving them sexually. Moreover, the criminalization of prostitution, which punished the woman but hardly touched her male customers, strengthened male power. So inherent to sex work under capitalism, there's an asymmetrical criminalization. This came to my mind talking about the kind of repressive attitudes toward women under Protestantism.
Yeah.
Because it takes two to tango. You know what I mean? This is wrapped up in my attitudes toward pornography also. It's wild to blame women for seeking sustainability under capitalism in a way that they know they can survive, and to cast moral judgments against them for doing so when they need viewers to do that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Prostitutes need Johns. Why are we not criminalizing or casting the same moral judgments against the Johns, against the viewers of this pornography? So there's an asymmetrical criminalization or an asymmetrical moral judgment that's happening there that I think also comes along the same kind of Protestantism. The quote that I'm trying to recall is something about like making women dress modestly so as to quell the sexual urges of men. It's somehow the women's responsibility to take men's inability to control themselves, you know?
Yeah.
To bear that burden.
Sorry,
I'm going to find the quote.
Yeah, I was spinning off on a weird, because I was like, was Joseph a virgin too? Does that just go unsaid? Mary had the virgin birth.
Yeah.
Joseph was also a virgin. Nobody ever talks about that. But that means nothing. It was just funny and popped into my head.
That's a good point, though.
Yeah.
I might have just written something cheeky next to it. Like, I have a couple of things here where it's like booby patrol, you know?
Yeah, dude.
Actually, I bet it is the booby patrol.
You bet it is the booby patrol.
Oh, no. Booby patrol is about midwives being made to narc on lactation.
Oh, yeah. Dude, I mean, you know, when they're talking about the state's restrictive reproductive policy, bucking echoes of today, man, when they were saying, I can't remember the city, but they required a pregnancy registry to make sure that none of them were terminated illicitly. And it's like, this is kind of going back to what I was talking about when it comes to the reproduction crisis, right? How much of this insanity, fucking sexual politics that we're seeing today is coming from the same fear of a crisis of reproduction. The kind of conservative backlash against abortion rights, of women's bodily autonomy, is that coming from the same kind of thing? I mean, I see even a similar parallel in these kinds of insane fundamentalist evangelical movements, like the quiverful movement, you know, which is where it's like you're filling your quiver full of arrows so you can fight God's battles, and the arrows are children in this regard. They just have like hundreds of children. You know, same with Elon Musk with his fucking tiny robo dick, you know, doing IVF with like 16 different women that he then immediately ghosts. It feels like it is part of the same kind of crisis of reproduction. That's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier. You can see echoes of that. You can see the parallel in today's society still.
Yeah. And there's an odd, I don't mean this in a Marxist sense, but there's an odd valorization of that vision of masculinity while somehow still keeping a like diminution of women in that case.
I mean, the whole trad wife thing is just fetish content, you know? Like, it's still exploitation, but we've valorized it into this thing that's like, it's hiding the exploitation behind it, you know what I mean? And I don't know, it kind of ties back to that same conversation we were having about fetishes.
I did find the quote.
Okay.
My note to myself just said, swayed by titties. So sexual passion undermined not only male authority over women, it also undermined a man's capacity for self-government, causing him to lose that precious head wherein Cartesian philosophy was to locate the source of reason. Masters of their domain, but easily swayed by titties.
Yeah, that's so funny, man.
Somehow it's the responsibility of women to handle this, you know? Fucking take care of your shit, dude.
Get it together, man.
But like, this is where she makes this argument that this is in the 16th and 17th centuries where censorship and prohibition come from. They define their relationship with sexuality for this reason.
Well, even to go back to the Puritan ideal, on that same page, they talk about social practices that are non-sexual. I mean, like, you know, the shunning of being naked, the use of cutlery instead of your hands to eat food. I mean, it's that kind of shame-based control, but it's the same thing.
Well, and with that, and this is kind of tied up to what you were saying about the, like, in the modern day, the valorization of the tradwife movement. There's this quote on 192 there where there's this transformation of female sexual activity into work, a service to men, and procreation. Central to this process was the banning as antisocial and virtually demonic of all non-productive, non-procreative forms of female sexuality. And so obviously we see the birth of anti-queerness here being blamed on this, but there's this weird tension with women where they're judged morally for sexual behavior, but also there's this, you know, propping up of procreation because it's necessary for the reproduction of labor power.
Just going back to that, it takes two to tango, man, especially in the context of anti-sodomy laws. Some guy decided to put his dick there. You know, it wasn't just the woman in this case, right? It's not like you had to convince the guy to do the poophole loophole, okay?
Poophole loophole.
Just to touch on that, though, it is super interesting that I really appreciated that in the aftermath of the Black Death, the fact that the church, you know, that's when you start to see anti-sodomy laws, anti-homosexuality laws come into play. Well, I guess, okay, that's not accurate, actually. But it's interesting to put those kinds of laws in the context of population crises, especially in the context of after the Black Death. The reason I cut myself off there is because she says that the first anti-gay laws were in like 1173, the fucking Council of Lateran or something like that. I'm pulling that out of my ear. But still, it's like you can see those kinds of things intensify when it comes to this kind of reproductive crisis.
Yeah.
Especially she mentions in Florence, I think, which was like a super gay city. Even they were like, actually, no gays. Just
Shout
wanted
out
to mention.
to the super gay cities.
Yeah. Shout outs.
It's wild that we haven't really talked about the witch hunts.
I know. What the hell? Well, it's because it's part of the history, man. I mean, we have talked about the witch hunts. It's just that we haven't talked about, like, the event. But the witch hunts themselves are fucking insane. Hundreds of thousands of women, and they were not just killed, but tortured. I mean, some of the descriptions of torture in this book are horrid. I mean, that's evident every time we read about anything involving torture. But, like, you know, they would put women in a cage and dunk them into the river until they were about to drown. They'd burn women at the stake.
She goes into the history of the F slur also.
I was literally about to say, that's exactly what came to mind, because fennel and the F slur have the same root, because they both stem from the fucking witch hunts and the burnings. But it was also a public event. That's the thing, too. It's like, this isn't just personal terror. It was meant to send a message. Like,
yeah, it was spectacle.
Yeah, exactly. It was spectacle. And something that she mentions about that I think is so supportive of her argument is the fact that there was no male organized resistance, with a few individual exceptions, you know, husbands, sons, fathers jumping into the fire to try to save their partners or whatever. No organized resistance, you know. And the thing is that on that page, she talks about an example where Basque fishermen hear that their wives are being murdered and inquisited upon, and they come back immediately and protest. And all it took was one protest to stop it, you know. So it's really clear that this isn't like some freak thing. It was like part of the social fabric. You know, it was really something that was intentionally done and constructed to create an environment in which women could be dominated. That was an environment of fear. That was an environment of intimidation. And that was an environment of isolation and alienation also.
Yep, 100%.
The only other topic I really thought we would have here was about colonization. I'm not sure exactly how we want to reach into that. I mean, that's a really nice thing about this book, is that it's not just about the white woman. Okay, sorry to put that so vulgarly, but she is very aware of the situation in the colonies, in the New World, the fact that this exact same process of division happened in the New World as well, with the exact same trappings, right? The same kind of witchcraft. I mean, the same witch hunts even.
Yeah, there's a great quote at the start of the chapter on colonization on 219. The continuity between the subjugation of the populations of the New World and that of the people in Europe, women in particular, in the transition to capitalism. In both cases, we have the forcible removal of entire communities from their land, large-scale impoverishment, the launching of Christianizing campaigns, destroying people's autonomy and communal relations. We also have a constant cross-fertilization whereby forms of repression that had been developed in the Old World were transported to the New World and then re-imported into Europe. This is that one same logic, one single logic that she mentions by name on the next page.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, it's basically the imperial boomerang. Like, we're just, we're seeing it again. It's not something that's just from like modern day colonization, modern day imperialism. I mean, it's hand in hand with capitalism as far back as it goes.
Yeah. Another great quote from this chapter is on 237, where again, it's her analysis is not confined to the white European woman. But she says on 237, witch hunting did not disappear from the repertoire of the bourgeoisie with the abolition of slavery. On the contrary, the global expansion of capitalism through colonization and Christianization ensured that this persecution would be planted in the body of colonized societies and in time would be carried out by the subjugated communities in their own names and against their own members. This idea that it would become a weapon used against colonized communities and become so integrated in those colonized communities that they would become colonizers themselves. They would take it on themselves and use it as a weapon of repression.
Yeah, oh my gosh, even when she's talking about the activities of the Spaniards, she says that women even started to face discrimination from traditional chiefs who were simply trying to keep their place of status, in this changing world. They're going with the flow, that kind of thing. I love, this is way back on page 17, but she says, it is not surprising then if large-scale violence and enslavement have been on the agenda as they were in a period of the transition. The difference today is that the conquistadors are officers of the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Once again, much of the violence unleashed is directed against women, for in the age of the computer, the conquest of the female body is still a precondition for the accumulation of labor and wealth, as demonstrated by the institutional investment in the development of new reproductive technologies. And the thing that came to me there was fucking Bill Gates, dude. Bill Gates has a real interest in Africa specifically, and a lot of that has to do with contraception. And I think that there's something intertwined there with this. There's something devilish there.
You skipped over this great line where she's talking about the IMF, who are still preaching the worth of a penny to the same populations which the dominant world powers have for centuries robbed and pauperized. Great fucking line.
Yeah, man.
Horrendous.
Great fucking book, dude.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to cavalcade it out?
I think we should jump into the cavalcade. Yeah, let's do it.
All right, cool. Just one that I thought was really funny on page 33. We didn't really talk that much about the heretical movements, except for the fact that they were counter to the mainstream. But I love the way that she poses it here. Although influenced by Eastern religions brought to Europe by merchants and crusaders, popular heresy was less a deviation from the orthodox doctrine than a protest movement aspiring to a radical democratization of social life. Heresy was the equivalent of a liberation theology for a medieval proletariat. Yeah. I appreciated that. Liberation theology is still interesting to me despite my atheism. So,
yeah. On 38... at the very top, these works demonstrate that the church attempted to impose a true sexual catechism, minutely prescribing the positions permitted during intercourse. Actually, only one was allowed. The days on which sex could be practiced, with whom it was permissible, and with whom forbidden. Missionary only.
Yeah, missionary only, dude. Man, can you just imagine, like, the government trying to do that kind of thing today? I mean, it's not that far off at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So it's only a couple more steps down the line, but, like... no doggy style.
It's coming.
I really hope not. I do appreciate on 43 she mentions what might have been the first dictatorship of the proletariat.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't really talk about a lot of the historical struggles, but man, the peasant movements, the peasant rebellions, and the peasant wars, those are baller. And also led by John Ball, one of them, the English Peasant Rising. He has a great quote. I can't remember. I just remember his name is John Ball, and he's a baller. But on 43, she mentions at Ghent, In 1335, the local bourgeoisie was overtaken by a rebellion of weavers who tried to establish a workers' democracy based on the suppression of all authorities. Defeated by an impressive coalition of forces, mind you that all of these rebellions were defeated by coalitions of otherwise divided bourgeois forces, very telling there. She says that they tried again in 1738 when they succeeded in establishing, with some exaggeration perhaps, what has been called the first dictatorship of the proletariat known in history. Their goal, according to Prosper Boissonade, was to raise journeymen against masters, wage earners, and great entrepreneurs, peasants against lords and clergy. It was said that they had contemplated the extermination of the whole bourgeois class, with the exception of children of 6, and the same for nobles.
Children of 5 are fair game.
Yeah. I'm sure they meant up to 6, but
so
still.
If you're 7,
you're 6-year-olds
face the law.
6-year-olds, yeah. So I appreciated that.
Yeah.
Shout out John Ball, not related to Ghent, but that was lit. I do know that Marx has some writings on the German Peasant War. I'm pretty sure. If we ever wanted to explore more of this history, that could be an interesting thing to do. I mean, I've heard a lot of recommendations about the Peasant War before we read this, and it makes sense now why. It is a proletarian struggle in a sense, yeah. I don't know, man. I don't have the capacity to open up to these eras. Sorry. I just can't.
I don't know. I don't want to be an idiot.
Yeah.
So I want to know the history, but I also know, if I am being real with myself, that I'm allowing myself to prolong a particular type of participation by convincing myself that I need to have done all of this reading in order to do it rightly.
Sure.
And so, there's a part of me that pushes back on, I need to read this, I need to know this, I need to examine this part of history, because I know, at least partly, that's coming from that part of my psyche,
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's tough, education is a continual process, so that's never a complaint in my mind, but I do agree with you that there's a point where it's I'm just prolonging the inevitable.
Yeah, it's not that I don't need to know it, nor that I won't benefit from knowing it. It's that it's not prerequisite to doing other stuff.
Sure.
And I just need to convince myself of that.
I think that's fair. I mean, this has been really fascinating because it shows a lot of parallels that you would not otherwise see without studying these eras. You can say, our modern reproductive policy, our modern war against women is a result of these kinds of longstanding misogynist practices, but to actually put them to a place in time, a set of policies by rulers and ruling classes, I think is really powerful. So for that, I will say that I'm willing to open myself up to these eras a little bit. I don't mean to be fully dismissive. I don't feel that I need to read about the fucking 1353 Peasant War to engage in revolutionary activity, but there's still something there.
Yeah, that's fair.
There's other peasant wars to worry about.
Oh, I have another silly one from 177.
Okay.
There's this description of these gatherings, witches' gatherings, reading its transgressive features from the viewpoint of the developing capitalist discipline of work. Perinetto points out that the nocturnal dimensions of the Sabbat, or Sabbat, I'm not sure, was a violation of the contemporary capitalist regularization of work time and a challenge to private property and sexual orthodoxy, as the night shadows blurred the distinctions between the sexes and between mine and thine. Perinetto also argues that the flight, the travel, an important element in the charges against the witches should be interpreted as an attack on the mobility of immigrant and itinerant workers, a new phenomenon reflected in the fear of vagabonds that much preoccupied the authorities of this period. I guess I could have stopped it that partway through. So maybe I'll just cut the last part of that quote. But that bit, the blurred the distinctions between the sexes, was hilarious to me. We're all the same in the dark, you never know.
Yeah. Well, it's a couple of things to add to that. A really great bit is when they talk about the women's reaction to the enclosures. Women would go out and push down the walls and the hedges and then smoke tobacco and drink ale afterwards. And the position of women at the time was such that they weren't as subject to the law, and she says that even men would dress like women to do that. Similarly, I think you should keep in the second half of that quote, because there's something interesting about the flight aspect of it, and it's a parallel back to the colonization of Canada, right? I can't remember if it's specifically the Canadian example, but in one of the indigenous colonization examples, she talks about a situation where I think it is the Jesuits tell the men that if the women run away from them, if they evade their advances, that they should chase them and threaten to imprison them. I think it's just a pretty clear parallel there in that same kind of flight aspect, and to tie it back to the same kind of flight aspect to the workers.
That's a good point. One thing that I thought was kind of interesting is this description of the devil, the medieval devil, on 186, 187. The witch hunt reversed the power relation between the devil and the witch. It was the woman now who was the servant, the slave, the succubus in body and soul, while the devil functioned as her owner and master, pimp and husband at once. Being a classic example of master-slave, husband-wife relation. The devil stamped her with his mark, had sexual intercourse with her, and in some instances even changed her name. And that's just crazy to me. I don't know, that just that forming, obviously, the conception of devil as master, witch as slave is problematic. There's the patriarchal relation of ownership that's part of that as well. It propagates that same kind of male ownership over women's bodies and souls that carries on even after the witch hunts, obviously.
Yeah. We executed hundreds of thousands of women because they were in the service of an evil man.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's part and parcel, man.
Yeah.
A masculine devil at that. She does mention like succubi and incubi, but one of them is pretty dominant, and it's succubi, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately. I yearn for incubi in my life. No, so much about sexuality too, even on the next page where a witch presumably could castrate men or make them impotent by freezing their generative forces or causing their penis to come out and draw back as she wished. Great.
I have a string of things here about speciesism and a slippery slope of dehumanization that I think is worth note. I would start on 194 because this is while she's talking about the witch hunts, and one piece of evidence that could be used against a woman as evidence of her witchery is her relationship with animals.
Right.
Such was the presence of animals in the witch's world that one must presume that they too, being the animals, were being put on trial. And she says animals, too, were subjected to a drastic devaluation, reduced to mere brutes, the ultimate other, perennial symbol of the worst human instincts. But the surplus of animal presences in the witches' lives also suggests that women were at a slippery crossroad between men and animals, and that not only female sexuality, but femininity as such was akin to animality. So there's already a degradation of women as being lesser than men that comes as the byproduct of this devaluation of animals, what I would call a speciesist attitude toward animals. And so that begins, and then you see that developed further on 200, but the over-sexualization of women and black men, the witches and the devils, must also be rooted in the position which they occupied in the international division of labor that was emerging on the basis of colonization of America, the slave trade, and the witch hunt. For the definition of blackness and femaleness as marks of bestiality and irrationality conformed with the exclusion of women in Europe and women and men in the colonies from the social contract implicit in the wage and the consequent naturalization of their exploitation. So again, this kind of like over-sexualization equaling bestiality, equaling being unreasoned, equaling being unworthy. That's all coming from this same one single logic that came from this view of animality as inherently lesser, the speciesist attitude, and it's being used to dehumanize human animals that they see fit, in this case, women and black men.
Mm-hmm. 2 points to that. One, so interesting that when she talks about Descartes' anatomical studies, he's so convinced that there's no soul in an animal that he starts his dissection practices with animals, right? And on top of that, he doesn't do any anesthesia because he thinks that they can't feel any pain.
Yep.
You know, so that speciesism, I mean, is there at a core, you know? Secondly, thinking back to the natives in Canada being taught to beat their children, right? In that block quote there, something so funny to me is that the guy says, you French think of only your children, we think of our children. And the guy responds with laughter because he says, let me actually find it. It's on page 111. He replied, this is the native person speaking. He replied, thou hast no sense. You French people love only your children, but we love all the children of the tribe. I began to laugh, seeing that he philosophized in horse and mule fashion. You know, he thought like an animal. Clearly, he hasn't developed thoughts of private property like me, the great European white man.
Yeah.
Fucking insane. You know, and it's part of our own separation from animality, just as we've talked about before. If you want to hear more about that, you can definitely check out our episode on Beyond Nature.
Yes. And to that end, I have one more little thread in this tapestry about speciesism. On 221, talking about colonization, she's talking about Columbus sailing to the Indies and the view of the Spanish of the indigenous people there, says that fed by militarism and Christian intolerance that looked at the other as mainly an object of aggression, thus it is not surprising if cannibal, infidel, barbarian, monstrous races, and devil worshipper were the ethnographic models with which the Europeans entered the new age of expansion, providing the filter through which missionaries and conquistadors interpreted the cultures, religions, and sexual customs of the peoples they encountered. And she goes on to talk about the nakedness and sodomy that qualified the Amerindians as being living in an animal state, thus capable of being turned into beasts of burden. It's laid bare there that this is the same exact colonization of the mind that justifies, animal slaughter or the devaluation of nature in general, the domination of nature in general. And then I would just close with that by saying, at the bottom of 221, as the conquest proceeded, however, no space was left for any accommodations. Imposing one's power over other people is not possible without denigrating them to the point where the possibility of identification is precluded.
Yeah.
I think that's it for me.
Yeah, I think I have hit all of my main ones here. Just a really damning quote on 103. It's very quick, but just to acknowledge, right, Eric Williams notes that hardly a brick in Liverpool or Bristol was not cemented with African blood. The world that we live in is built on the backs of slavery.
Yep.
And neo-slavery, whatever you want to call that, the exploitation of the other. It's just the truth. All right?
You should read this book if...
You should read this book, period. Yeah, I think that you should read this book if you don't know anything about the witch hunts. I think you should read this book if you want a feminist lens of the transition from feudalism into capitalism. I think that's a really solid one. And you should read this book if you haven't already.
Yeah. I would agree. This is a top 10 book for me off the show so far.
Oh, yeah.
Hands down. Definitely going to be reading more Federici. You should read this book if you find radical feminist literature lacking a socialist consciousness. You should read this book if you find socialist literature lacking a feminist consciousness. Yes. She opens the preface by saying basically that.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to say.
And that spoke to me perfectly. So definitely, you should read this book, period.
Yeah. If you were like me, and like I said in the beginning, if the pillars of patriarchy and race are ones that seem to you to lay outside the system of capital, if they seem to be on their own, then you should definitely read this book.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
We definitely barely scratched the surface of everything that's covered in this book. So if there are things that you wish we would have brought up on the show from the text, if you have other texts related to this, knowing how much we're glazing it, that you think this will be, you have recommendations for us based on how much we liked this. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns, send them over to us.
Yeah, let us know. I mean, if there's something you disagreed with in this book that we said, then definitely let us know too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
leftunreadfeedback@gmail.com.
Did you have any questions from this text?
Oh, shit, I skipped that.
It doesn't matter. Did this text leave you with any questions?
I obviously have unresolved thoughts about the commodification of the body under capitalism that I would like to explore more. I don't know that I can frame it into a question, and I think I have a fundamental understanding of the necessity of that happening under capitalism, right? But there's still, I don't know, I can't quite close the loop of those thoughts. Mm-hmm. So there's a question in there somewhere that this book was definitely scratching for me, Yeah. What about you?
Very similarly, this book answered a lot of questions for me. That was something.
That's true.
Yeah. One question that I do still have, and this kind of has to do with maybe Foucault, honestly, and it has to do with trans women, And I know that's outside of the realm of reproduction when we're talking about that, but there's something that really spoke to me when she talks about Foucault talking about the separation of the mind and body as the creation of the body as the other. And there's something dysmorphic about that.
Oh, yeah.
You're separate, your mind, your whatever idealized version of yourself is separated from the reality of your body, and that seems to be something that is only more present in the modern day. So that's kind of an avenue which I think could have some interesting purchase. It's not related necessarily to this book at all, but it is a question that came to mind in the discussion of the other that we were having. So
next up, to prepare for the next episode, you should read
Michael Parenti's Democracy for the Few.
Yeah. Goated Parenti, we're coming back.
Rest in peace.
R.I.P.
Yeah.
Just left the mortal plane.
We didn't agree on everything, but we did agree on a lot.
Yeah. So grab your copy.
Yeah, and don't get left unread, y'all.
I said that like I had something else to say.
I know. I was waiting for you to finish your sentence.
I didn't think it through. Yeah. Bye.
See ya.